Eddard Stark sat in the darkness of his cramped solar in the Red Keep, listening to the faint toll of distant bells. They were not funeral bells yet, though he felt a gathering sense of doom in his chest. It was well past midnight, and most of the castle lay sleeping or engaged in their secret intrigues beneath the layers of red stone. A single candle flickered at his side, shadows dancing across the pale parchment he had been poring over for hours. He had read the same words time and again, but no matter how many times he repeated them in his mind, they offered no solution to his predicament. The truth that Robert Baratheon's children with Queen Cersei were not Baratheons at all rested like a boulder on Ned's shoulders. He had done everything in his power to preserve the honor of the realm, to offer Cersei a chance to flee before Robert returned from his hunt. Yet in the end, he had miscalculated, misread the cruelty of those at court, and found himself now cornered like a wounded wolf. His days felt numbered, even if Robert still breathed for the moment. He had heard the king lay dying after that ill-fated boar hunt. With the rightful ruler's life slipping away, Ned knew the realm would soon be in chaos. Normally, the honor he so cherished forbade him from even contemplating the path that had begun forming in his mind. Yet the knowledge of how his father and brother had been murdered, how the Lannisters had brought ruin upon the Seven Kingdoms in so many subtle ways, had awakened in him a grim fury. He thought of his daughters, Sansa held as a delicate hostage to her own queenly dreams, and Arya, a wild, independent child, somewhere in the city, lost or in hiding since the Gold Cloaks had taken Ned into custody for the second time. He thought of Robb in Winterfell, too young to face war, but old enough to be forced into it. He thought of Catelyn, who had risked so much to keep the family safe. And so he thought, if justice would not be served by the laws of men, then perhaps it was time to turn to a more shadowy brand of justice. For days, the notion slithered through his mind. Late at night, when the shadows grew long, he found himself recalling half-remembered stories about a mysterious order of assassins from Braavos, the Faceless men. He had never wanted to sully his hands with such an approach, but his world had changed, forcibly molded by the city of King's Landing, where cunning and deceit reigned. He had tried everything else. Honesty, rational appeal, mercy. None of it had worked. Now, the last dregs of his honor warred with the knowledge that if he continued to play by the rules of the game, House Stark would be obliterated. Quiet footfalls pulled Ned from his thoughts. He doused the candle and listened, straining his ears in the darkness. A guardsman might be passing the corridor. He had to be careful about everything these days. Even reading secret letters in his own solar was dangerous. So many spies infested the Red Keep that one could never be certain what small piece of intelligence might spark a fire of suspicion. When the sound retreated, he let out a slow breath and lit the candle once more. The letter that had come to him that morning. A mere slip of parchment, sealed in plain wax without a sigil, rested upon the table. In it, a nameless scribe claimed to have knowledge of the whereabouts of a man skilled in final solutions, a phrase that made Ned's stomach churn. But it also made him think of what Tywin Lannister had done to Rhaegar's children in King's Landing, and how such brutality had earned the Lannisters a place at the new king's side. It made him think of the cunning that existed in this city, and how in the end, the illusions of chivalry were often undone by the bloodiest edges of warfare. It was a compromise of everything he had stood for, but House Stark was at stake. He pressed his fingers to his brow, recalling how he had once sworn to do what was right, no matter the cost. Robert was dying, Joffrey would soon sit the throne illegitimately, and Ned realized how close his own life was to ending. Varys had practically told him that if he continued to defy the Queen, he would end up with his head on a spike. And if that happened, what good would come to his family? A dead man could not protect those he loved. Perhaps the time had truly come to step into the shadows. He composed a message in the most cryptic language he could muster without losing clarity. A handful of lines that would signal his readiness to meet this Braavosi agent. It felt wrong, but each scratch of the quill carried a quiet determination. He signed it simply, "The Wolf." Then he folded it, sealed it in plain wax, and felt a sense of moral weight pressing upon him. Still, he pressed the seal's edge into the wax and blew gently to let it cool. At dawn, he would send it with a man he trusted, or at least a man he believed the Lannisters had not suborned. Days passed in a haze of uncertainty. The king died. Cersei crowed her son Joffrey king of the Seven Kingdoms. Ned was arrested outright and forced to kneel before the boy in the throne room. There, with the assembled court watching, he saw Sansa trembling as she pleaded for his life. He saw Peter Baelish whispering as though he were an ally, but it was all a farce. The Lannisters seemed eager to execute him, or at least to extract a confession from him that would paint them in a legitimate light. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, the letter he had sent off tugged at him, reminding him that a slender hope might still exist. They gave him a penance in the black cells, a single crust of bread a day, water tasting of mold. Time lost all meaning down there. In the darkness, he clung to memories of Winterfell, of the crisp northern air, of how the snows would drift into the courtyard. He heard faint echoing footsteps above and wondered if rescue would ever come. Finally, he was granted a public hearing in the courtyard of the Great September of Baelor. Under pressure, with Sansa sobbing and the city roaring for his head, he confessed to treason he had never truly committed. He declared Joffrey the rightful king as demanded. He had hoped to save himself, or at least to buy enough time for the letter he had written to reach its intended recipient. That moment on the September steps, he felt a shame so deep it nearly tore him apart, but it was better to be a living traitor in the eyes of the realm than a dead hero who could no longer shield his children from the vipers at court. He watched the tension in the crowd. Some demanded blood. Some looked upon him with pity, others with amusement. Then, just as Ned saw the glitter of the sword in Island Payne's hand, a wave of confusion rippled through the onlookers. At first, it seemed as though a riot had broken out. It turned out, after much chaos, that a small band of men in the crowd had incited trouble, distracting the gold cloaks while a riot flared. Joffrey, young and ill-prepared, was ushered away before he could pronounce the final sentence. By the time the dust settled, the courtyard was a swirl of chaotic energy. Ned was roughly dragged back into custody, but the moment's delay had saved his head, at least for one more day. In the end, the Lannisters decided to wait on Ned's fate, calling for a private trial in the Red Keep. It was rumored that they wanted to strip him of titles and holdings, to set him to the wall or to use him as a bargaining chip against Robb, who was said to be mustering the North in open rebellion. Still, each passing hour gave Ned hope that the letter might yield the results he needed. For if the Faceless men had taken his coin, if the gold had somehow been secured, then the infiltration might already be in motion. They moved him to a less odious cell in the dungeons, guarded day and night by Lannister men. He was given slightly better food, told to wait for word of his trial. He slept on straw, but at least he slept without the stench of rot burning his nostrils. On the second night, he jolted from shallow slumber to find a hooded figure standing outside the bars of his cell. "It has been arranged," the figure whispered. Ned tried to peer through the gloom to discern a face, but the flickering torchlight revealed nothing but a smooth expression. It was as if the man's skin had been wiped blank like a slate. It made Ned's heart pound with a mixture of fear and relief. "I have nothing," Ned began. Then he recalled the instructions in the letter. He had included a small sum of gold in the package he had sent, making certain to pay half the rumored cost. The rest, by necessity, was to be promised from the coffers of House Stark. A monstrous sum, truly, but the Faceless men never accepted a contract without an exact price. And the price for a life, no, for several lives, was not small. "Your gold has been weighed," said the hooded figure in a voice that barely disrupted the silence. It was almost inhuman in its calm detachment. "The many-faced god has heard your plea. The coin is enough. We shall have the rest when the job is done, yes." Ned swallowed hard, thinking of the precious resources of Winterfell. Such a cost was a bitter bargain. But what was House Stark if all its leaders lay dead? "Yes," Ned breathed. "I promised. You must." His throat constricted around the words. "You must do this swiftly. My time runs short." "The Lannisters." The figure raised a pale hand, silencing him. "Death comes when the many-faced god wills it, and not a moment sooner or later. But the wolf's desire shall be met as soon as the opportunity is ripe. Those you named will face the end." Ned nodded, feeling his stomach twist. He thought of the names he had provided: Cersei, Joffrey, and the dwarf Tyrion Lannister. Though Tyrion's guilt was questionable, Ned had included him out of fear of the entire brood. He had even written Jaime's name, though the Kingslayer was rumored to be off in the field, or possibly captured by Robb. For names. For major lives upon which the future of the kingdom pivoted. If eliminating them was the surest path to saving House Stark, then so be it. "Leave Sansa unharmed," Ned whispered. "In fact, I beg you to do nothing that might harm her. My daughter's safety is paramount." The hooded figure's voice was so quiet it seemed to manifest in Ned's mind rather than his ears. "We know." The figure turned and disappeared into the darkness without another word, and Ned was left with a sense of creeping dread. He had taken a great step off a moral cliff, and he would have to live or die with the consequences. The next morning, Ned Stark was escorted to a small hearing chamber near the throne room. Joffrey sat the throne, surrounded by Cersei, Peter Baelish, Varys, Pycelle, and the Kingsguard. Sansa stood trembling at the side, her face pale. Ned kept his head bowed, still playing the role of the contrite traitor. They read charges of treason. Cersei purred that he should be sent to the wall, stripped of all titles and honor. Joffrey was about to speak, likely to pronounce some further punishment, when chaos struck. A messenger stumbled into the hall, blood on his lips, and collapsed at the foot of the dais. The Lannister guards rushed forward, confusion spreading. Ned watched the scene with an icy, calculating gaze. He knew not what was happening, but a spark in his mind wondered if this was part of the Faceless men's plan. Joffrey demanded someone check on the fallen messenger. Baelish knelt, pressing 2 fingers against the man's throat. When he withdrew his hand, Ned saw a subtle glistening on Baelish's fingertip. Then, Baelish's eyes flickered with something akin to fear. He wiped the substance surreptitiously on his handkerchief, and for a moment, Ned suspected that whatever this was, it involved poison. In that confusion, a Kingsguard knight, Mandon Moore, suddenly jerked from his place and swung his sword not at Ned but at another guard. A fierce clang of steel echoed, and the Lannister guard collapsed, blood staining the marble floor. Gasps and screams erupted. Joffrey stood abruptly, his face ashen with shock. Cersei screamed for the other Kingsguard to seize Mandon Moore. But as they moved to do so, Mandon Moore's features seemed to ripple, his skin shifting. The sight made some step back in horror. In another flash, a swirl of confusion, Mandon Moore's helmet toppled away, revealing not the pale, stoic face of the knight, but a stranger's visage with unsettling gray eyes. Ned's heart hammered, for he had never actually witnessed the legendary face-changing abilities of a faceless man. Whispers soared through the throne room. Cersei shrieked, "Kill him!" But the figure who had been Mandon Moore slipped deftly through the guards, blade flicking out with lethal precision. 2 more men fell, throats cut. It was then that the assassin lunged toward Joffrey himself, sword raised. Joffrey, young and untested, stumbled backward onto the Iron Throne, slicing his own hand on a jagged blade protruding from the seat's cruel design. Blood dripped from the spikes of steel, but the assassin seemed to want more. A Kingsguard man, the Hound Sandor Clegane, blocked the path with a snarl. He clashed steel with the faceless man, sparks flying. The assassin was quick, preternaturally silent, but the Hound was strong and brutal, forcing him back in a storm of swordplay. Joffrey and Cersei both cried for help, and the remaining Lannister guards scrambled to form a perimeter. Ned felt a hand grab him from behind. A second figure, this one in the garb of a courtier, face half hidden by a silken scarf, pulled him away from the dais and hissed, "This way!" For a moment, Ned resisted, but a glance showed that Sansa was being pulled away by a pair of Kingsguard, and there was no way for him to go to her side without being cut down. He prayed she would be safe. The second figure half-dragged Ned out of the throne room, leading him through a dark corridor. The sounds of shouting, swords clanging, and running feet receded behind them. They emerged in an empty audience chamber. The courtier whirled on Ned, yanking the scarf away to reveal a face that was even more unsettling. Too perfect, as though carved from smooth ivory, with eyes that seemed lifeless. "We are the many-faced god's instrument," the assassin whispered, voice as calm as a breeze. "But your moment to depart is now. If you stay, you will die, and the cause is lost." "My daughter," Ned rasped, voice thick with panic. "The job is not yet finished, but we must depart. There is more than one of us at work." Ned tried to gather his thoughts. The plan was chaos, indeed. How were they to kill Cersei, Joffrey, Tyrion, Jaime all at once, or sequentially? The corridors were filled with Lannister men, with watchers loyal to the Iron Throne. But the figure did not give him time to question. He pressed a slender dagger into Ned's hand. "You must find your own route from here if you will not follow me. We have done what we can to free you of your prison. Guard yourself well, Wolf." The assassin turned, gliding silently toward a tapestry that covered a door. "Wait," Ned hissed. "I must find Sansa. You must help me." The assassin paused but did not turn. "If the many-faced god wills it, the one assigned to the Lannister brood will finish the task. But I will do what I can." Then he vanished, slipping behind the tapestry like a ghost. Ned stood alone, heart thundering. That half-formed plan of his, hire the most notorious assassins in Essos, set them upon the Lannisters, seemed now to have ignited an inferno. He had expected quiet murders, poison in the night, illusions that might appear as accidents. Instead, the Faceless men had chosen to strike brazenly in the throne room. Why? Perhaps an opportunity had presented itself, or perhaps this was part of their twisted code. Ned realized that with King's Landing in an uproar, he had a chance to escape, but retrieving Sansa in the midst of this turmoil would be nigh impossible alone. He gripped the dagger, thinking of how far from home he was. For an instant, he recalled the words of House Stark. "Winter is coming." Indeed, it felt as though the winter of his soul had come. Any illusions that he could remain honorable in this viper's nest had to die. If he wanted to save Sansa, to save Arya, to free them from Lannister clutches, he would have to act decisively. Gritting his teeth, he pulled open the door that led to a narrow hall. Servants fled in all directions, some carrying trays of half-eaten meals, others simply trying to find somewhere safe. Ned slipped in among them, head bowed, letting his gray tunic pass for a servant's attire. He was grateful that his face was not as well known as the gold-haired royals, though doubtless there were those who could identify him if they looked closely enough. He wandered through halls of tapestries, the hush occasionally broken by distant screams or calls of alarm. Clusters of guards ran here and there, but often in confusion. Nobody seemed to know exactly where to be or who was attacking. The rumored riot from earlier still echoed in the city streets, and now a deadly infiltration had taken place in the very heart of power. The Great September, the throne room, the corridors. It was as if the entire city had erupted in violence at once, orchestrated by some hidden hand. Yet Ned suspected only part of this was the Faceless men's doing. King's Landing was always a tinderbox. One spark and chaos spread. He used that chaos to slip further into the Red Keep's labyrinth. He made his way to the tower that housed the royal apartments. If Sansa was being held anywhere, it would be there under guard, or perhaps in Cersei's private chambers. He had to at least try. Step by wary step, he ascended a spiral staircase, hearing shouts from above. At one landing, he spotted a pair of Lannister guards blocking the path. They stood at the threshold of a corridor that led to private rooms, presumably belonging to the Queen or the King. Ned pressed his back against the cold stone, hidden in the shadows. "Keep watch," one guard told the other, with a nervous glance toward the top of the stairs. "The Hound might be up here soon, or the Queen or the bloody Kingslayer. We can't let anyone pass." The other nodded, though his eyes seemed wide with fear. News traveled fast, and the knowledge that assassins who could change faces roamed the corridors had clearly unsettled the men. Ned clutched the slender dagger. He had always believed in open confrontation, honorable duels, but that code would get him killed swiftly now. Instead, He waited until their attention slid away from the stairs. The first guard shifted his weight, turning to say something to his companion. That was the moment Ned lunged from the shadows, driving his dagger beneath the arm of the first man. A savage angle of the blade found a gap in the armor. The guard cried out, stumbling sideways, and Ned took advantage to snatch the sword from the falling man's scabbard. The second guard roared. Swinging his sword in a wide arc, Ned managed to parry, though his arms trembled with the force. He was no champion fighter like Jaime Lannister or Barristan Selmy, but he had the skill of a seasoned warrior. He forced the guard's blade high and stepped in, thrusting the dagger into his torso. A moment later, both guards lay moaning on the floor, mortal wounds leaking red across the stone. Ned felt nausea swirl in his gut, but he steeled himself. These were the wages of his choice. Wiping the dagger on the guard's cloak, Ned crept onward. He paused at each door, listening for signs of Sansa or of watchers inside. He found only empty rooms, furniture tossed about as though someone had ransacked them. The next corridor was likewise deserted, though a faint scuffle of feet made him flatten against a wall. A moment later, a woman in a plain dress hurried by, eyes darting fearfully. She had not even noticed him. He let her pass. Finally, after turning another corner, he heard the distinct sound of sobbing. He recognized that voice. Sansa. Heart pounding, he sprinted to the door at the far end of the corridor. It was locked, but he slammed his shoulder against it, once, twice, until the cheap wood splintered. Stumbling inside, he found Sansa curled in a corner, tears streaming down her face. A single maid hovered nearby, trembling. Sansa gasped, "Father?" At the sight of Ned. He dropped his sword and knelt, folding her in his arms. She sobbed uncontrollably for a few moments, stammering incoherent words about Joffrey, about how everything was going wrong. Ned tried to hush her, though tears pricked at his own eyes to see his daughter so frightened. The maid looked terrified, but Ned recognized her as one who served the queen's apartments. "Hush," Ned said to Sansa. "We must leave, and quickly. The castle is no longer safe." "Where do we go?" Sansa whimpered. "They said I had to stay here, that Joffrey," he said. She dissolved into more tears. Ned felt a surge of anger at Joffrey for terrifying her this way. "We go somewhere safe, somewhere away from them." He guided her to stand. She clung to his arm. The maid stared at them with eyes as round as saucers, but she did not move to call for the guards. Maybe she had no love for the Lannisters either. "Go," Ned said to the maid quietly. "Find a place to hide until this is over." He could not bring himself to harm a frightened servant. The maid just nodded quickly, curtsied, and fled the room. Ned took Sansa's hand and led her back into the corridor, stepping over the bodies of the guards he had slain. Sansa gasped, covering her mouth. Ned squeezed her hand and whispered apologies, as though trying to shield her from the sight. But she had to see it. There was no more innocence left in King's Landing. They retraced his path down the stairs, careful to keep to the shadows whenever they heard footsteps or shouting. Twice they nearly stumbled into roving packs of gold cloaks who looked to be searching for intruders. But the chaotic nature of the keep's corridors aided them. Each time, they managed to slip away, sometimes by ducking behind tapestries or in dim corners. Sansa trembled so violently that Ned was sure the guards could hear her teeth chatter. But none found them. Eventually, they reached the courtyard. It was a scene of madness. Dead or wounded men lay scattered about, many in Lannister livery, some in other attire. Horses whinnied in distress at their tethers. Smoke curled from a building near the stables where a small fire burned. Shouts echoed around them. Ned wondered if Stannis or Renly had somehow invaded, but that seemed impossible. Perhaps the city's small folk had stormed the gates in the midst of confusion. He pulled Sansa close behind him, weaving between wagon debris and the bodies of the fallen. They made for a postern gate near the southeast corner of the Red Keep. This was the same gate he had once considered using to smuggle Arya out, had events gone differently. Now, with luck, it would be their route to freedom. A figure stepped out of the shadows, sword held low. Ned's heart jumped until he recognized the man's face. Jory Castle's cousin, Tommerd, a loyal retainer from the north. The man's face was ashen, and he was bleeding from a cut on his arm, but relief spread across his rugged features when he saw Ned. "Lord Stark," he gasped. "Thank the old gods. I feared you lost." Ned gripped Tommerd's shoulder. "We haven't much time. Is the way clear?" "Aye, for now," Tommerd said. "The gatehouse is lightly guarded. A handful of them remain, but I believe we can fight our way past, especially with this confusion." He glanced at Sansa, relief mixing with concern. "And the little lady? Is she hurt?" Sansa shook her head, tears still glistening, but she tried to stand straighter. "No, I'm all right. Good. Let's go." "Then, my lord." They moved quickly, hugging the shadows along the courtyard's perimeter. Ned feared every moment that someone would raise the alarm, but the entire castle was in an uproar. When they reached the postern gate, they found 2 guards with a look of near panic on their faces, evidently uncertain whether to stay or flee. Tommerd rushed forward, bellowing a wordless roar. Ned followed, weapon in hand, and the guards only managed a clumsy defense. Tommerd dispatched one with a savage blow, while Ned disarmed the other. That guard fell to his knees, begging for mercy. Ned's mouth was dry as he glanced at Tommerd, who lifted his sword. "No," Ned said, swallowing the lump of bitterness. "Let him live. He is only a young boy, can't be older than Robb." He gave the guard a stern glare. "Flee if you value your life. We are leaving this cursed place." The guard nodded frantically, eyes wide, and scrambled away. Tommerd frowned but did not question Ned's decision. He grabbed the lever that opened the postern gate. The iron portcullis rose, allowing them egress to the ramp that led out of the Red Keep and into the city of King's Landing. They hurried out onto the muddy streets. Smoke hung in the air, and they could hear distant shouting. Small folk roamed in frantic packs, some looting, some simply fleeing the chaos. The stench was worse than ever, a combination of sewage, rotting refuse, and now the acrid tang of fire. Ned kept a firm grip on Sansa's hand, unwilling to let her out of his sight for even a moment. Tommerd motioned toward a small stable near the city walls. "We might find horses there, my lord. Then we can try to reach the gates before they're shut. Or, if the gates are shut, we can bribe or fight our way through. Better that than staying here." Ned nodded, though a part of him knew that the city might be sealed by now. Even in chaos, the Lannisters wouldn't let all highborn prisoners escape so easily. But their best chance to vanish from Joffrey's reach was indeed to get out of King's Landing altogether. If luck favored them, they could reunite with the northern forces that Robb was mustering. As they made their way through the winding streets, keeping to less traveled alleys, Ned's thoughts turned to the Faceless men. He had seen one attempt on Joffrey, but had that assassin survived? What of Cersei, Tyrion, Jaime? Had any of them fallen already? Or did their cunning protect them still? He felt an uncomfortable pang of guilt. Even if the Lannisters had to be stopped, the image of a masked killer chasing a teenage boy, no matter how cruel that boy, unsettled him. But he forced the thought aside. His priority was now Sansa's safety, and Arya's if she was still in the city somewhere. They reached the stable. Tommerd found a pair of half-decent horses. They quickly saddled up. Ned helped Sansa onto one, then climbed up behind her, letting Tommerd ride the other. They set out at a brisk canter, weaving through the debris-littered streets. By now the sun was well into the sky, though it was hard to tell behind the haze of smoke. Soon they arrived near the mud gate. It was typically used by fishermen and traders, but it still had a guard presence. As Ned had feared, the gate was sealed. A throng of small folk jostled there, demanding to be let out or in. Archers on the wall shouted at them to disperse. Some men hammered on the gate in a fury, only to be driven back by crossbow bolts that thudded into the dirt at their feet. Tommerd reined in his horse. "We'll not get through that crowd easily, my lord." Ned frowned, scanning the walls. He could see the glint of Lannister crimson up on the ramparts. Even if the city had fallen into chaos, Certain strategic points were still well guarded, it seemed. We'll have to circle around, see if there's a smaller postern we can slip through, or perhaps bribe our way out near the King's Gate. They turned back into the maze of streets, trying to keep a low profile. Sansa was exhausted, head bowed against Ned's chest, but she did not complain. So many times, Ned thought he heard footsteps trailing them. He caught glimpses of figures that seemed to melt away whenever he turned, leaving him uncertain if they were real or phantoms of his anxious mind. Perhaps the Faceless men were watching him, though whether to protect or simply observe their client was unclear. They came across a marketplace that had been looted. Overturned stalls, scattered vegetables, broken crates. A woman wailed over a child's body. Rats scurried in the corners. King's Landing was devouring itself. Ned led the way through the wreckage, Tommard close behind. Without warning, a group of armed ruffians stepped out from behind a toppled wagon. Their leader was a lean man with blackened teeth and a cunning glint in his eyes. He eyed Ned and Tommard warily. "Hold there, friends. Looks like you've come from the Red Keep. Might you have some coin to spare? Or a bit of food? Or perhaps that fine sword?" Tommard growled, shifting in his saddle. Ned raised a hand, indicating caution. There were at least 5 of these ruffians, and more might be lurking. The black-toothed man had a short sword in hand, and the others carried clubs or knives. "We have no coin," Ned lied, "and we only want to pass." The man's gaze slid to Sansa, and he smiled unpleasantly. "That's a nice little bird you have there. Maybe we should keep her for ourselves." He nodded to his companions, and they began to fan out, encircling the riders. Ned felt his grip tighten on the reins. He stared the man down. "If you touch my daughter, I will kill you." He spoke with quiet intensity. These men might not know or care who he was, but the threat in his voice was all too real. The man smirked. "A father's love, is it? You're about to find out that father's love doesn't count for much here. How about you toss down your weapon and we'll let you?" He never finished his demand. A silent shape dropped from the crumbling roof above, landing behind one of the ruffians. Ned blinked as the shape flicked out a blade so quickly he barely saw it. Blood spattered across the dirt, and the ruffian crumpled. Another spin, another slash, and the second ruffian toppled. It was so sudden that the black-toothed leader froze, shock etched on his features, before he stumbled back with a cry. Tommard seized the chance. He spurred his horse forward, sword swinging, driving 2 more of the assailants away. Ned watched the silent shape, masked in a hood, dispatch the third with brutal efficiency. The black-toothed man, seeing his comrades fall, turned and fled, vanishing down an alley, the sound of his footsteps echoing. Ned exhaled, glancing at the hooded figure who stood among the bodies, breathing quietly. The figure turned, and though Ned could not see a face beneath that dark hood, he recognized the same aura of uncanny composure that had marked his visitor in the cell. The assassin gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then stepped forward. "Your path is not yet at its end," the figure said. A woman's voice, Ned realized with a start. Soft, clipped, carrying an accent he could not place. "We have done as was agreed." Ned swallowed, mind racing. Have the Lannisters? Are they dead?" The figure inclined her head slightly. "We have struck at them. The young king was nearly ours. The queen is in hiding. We do not yet know the dwarf's whereabouts, and the Kingslayer is rumored to be at large in the field or taken captive by your son's forces. The job is not finished, and so the many-faced god still awaits his due. You must deliver the remainder of the payment if you wish our efforts to continue." For a moment Ned felt torn. What had he unleashed upon the realm? Even if he hated the Lannisters, to murder a boy king felt monstrous. But he reminded himself of all that had been done to House Stark. He thought of the heads on spikes, of the cruelty inflicted upon them. Yet a small voice whispered that he was crossing a line that he could never uncross. "I will," he said finally, his voice ragged. "When I am safe with my family, you'll have the rest. If you can finish it, if you can end them all." He closed his eyes. "Do it quickly." A solemn inclination of the head was all he received. Then the assassin moved like a wraith to the side of the alley, footsteps barely stirring the dust. Ned felt a hand on his bridle. Tomard's gaze was worried. "My lord?" he asked quietly, as if uncertain who Ned was speaking to. Sansa just stared with wide, frightened eyes, clinging to Ned's cloak as if it were a lifeline. "Let's move on," Ned said. They skirted past the bodies, the hooded killer watching them from the edge of the shadows. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone, melding into the chaos. They followed the alleys toward another gate, but the city was in full panic now. Fires burned in more neighborhoods. Groups of looters roamed with reckless desperation, and occasional pockets of guards tried to maintain order. At one point, they passed a red-roofed sept that had been broken into, the doors smashed, the interior desecrated. Ned saw no sign of official Lannister patrols in the immediate vicinity, as though everyone was too busy defending the castle or the wealthier parts of the city. Finally, they reached the King's Gate, near the northeastern side of King's Landing. This gate was also closed, but fewer guards stood upon it, though there were enough to pose a threat. The portcullis was down, the massive wooden doors barred from within. A small crowd lingered, hoping to be let out, but they had not yet grown desperate enough to challenge the guards. Ned pulled the horses behind a half-collapsed cart to confer with Tomard. "We might bribe them if they'll listen," Tomard suggested. "Though we've not much coin, we can offer promises of gold from House Stark." Ned frowned, suspecting that Lannister orders might outweigh bribery. But they had to try. "Stay here with Sansa. Keep your sword ready in case this goes poorly." He dismounted, handing the reins to Tomard, and walked forward slowly, arms raised in a gesture of peace. The small folk parted to let him pass. The half-dozen guards on the wall raised crossbows. The captain, a burly man with a swollen lip, shouted, "Halt! State your business or be shot." "My business is leaving King's Landing," Ned called. "I'm Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell." He saw their eyes widen, murmurs passing among them. "I was the king's hand, until the Lannisters betrayed me. You are sworn to serve the crown, but all is chaos now. Let us pass, and you shall be rewarded. Get in our way, and I promise you, my men will not spare you." He tried to imbue his voice with the authority of the North. The captain spat over the parapet. "We've got orders from Queen Cersei. No one in or out until this is done. Especially not a traitor like you." Ned felt a black frustration rising. He glanced around, seeing the anxious faces of small folk who wanted no part in this conflict. "Then you will die for a queen who may not even draw breath come morning? The city is in open rebellion. Half of it is on fire, and you still do as you're told by those who can't protect you." One of the other guards shifted nervously. "But if we open the gate, the Lannisters..." The captain silenced him with a scowl. "Stay put, or I'll have your hide." Ned began to despair, but at that moment, a figure appeared on the wall, brushing past one of the crossbowmen. He wore a cloak of black and red, hooded, but his posture was strangely confident. Ned's breath hitched. It was one of them, another faceless man. The captain turned, startled. "Who are you?" In a lightning move, the hooded man drove a hidden dagger into the captain's armpit. The captain collapsed, blood drenching his surcoat. The other guards cried out, but in the same fluid motion, the killer seized the crossbow from the nearest man and fired it into the chest of another. Ned watched in horror and awe as the assassin pivoted, slicing the hamstring of a third guard. The remaining men froze, uncertain, before one turned to flee. The assassin calmly wiped the blade on the dead captain's cloak, then stepped up to the mechanism controlling the gate's chains. With a grunt of effort, he cranked the wheel. The portcullis creaked upward, inch by inch. The small folk gaped, some cheering, some crying, as they realized the exit was opening. Tomard saw the chance. He nudged Sansa forward, beckoning to Ned. Ned scrambled to his horse's side and mounted swiftly. Sansa clung to him. Then, as the portcullis rose fully, they spurred the horses into a gallop. The crowd surged forward too, a mass exodus seeking to escape the city. Ned heard shouts from above, the Lannister men who still lived or who might be on the adjacent towers. A few crossbow bolts hissed down, but the aim was rushed. One or two small folk fell, screaming, while the others barreled out through the open gate in a flood of desperate humanity. Ned managed to guide his horse through the crush, Tomard close behind, forging a path. They galloped out beyond the city walls and onto the open King's Road. The sky felt vast, the air marginally fresher. Sansa shuddered in his arms, but Ned gripped her tight, letting out a breath he had been holding for what seemed like hours. They were out. For some distance, they rode at speed, not daring to slow until the city's walls were far behind. At last, they reached a small copse of trees by the roadside, where they halted to catch their breath. Sansa practically collapsed into Ned's embrace. Tomard checked the horses, patting their sweaty flanks. They said little, the weight of all that had happened pressing on them like a storm cloud. When Ned finally spoke, his voice trembled with relief and lingering dread. "We've escaped for the moment, but they may come after us." Tomard nodded. "Aye, we should head north as fast as we can, or find a ship east if that is safer." Ned's mind was a whirl. Where was Arya? Where was the rest of his household? He had no idea if they had found a way out. He prayed that Yoren from the Night's Watch, or someone else, might have helped Arya slip away in the chaos. But there was no guarantee. He glanced back toward the city. It lay behind them like a wounded beast, columns of smoke rising. He thought of the Faceless men. They had parted the jaws of the trap, letting him slip free, but at what cost? North, he decided at last. We make for Moat Cailin. If we can reach Robb's forces, we'll be safer. He inhaled sharply. But we can't return to Winterfell blindly, not while war is brewing. The Lannisters will not let this pass easily. Sansa blinked up at him, tears still clinging to her lashes. What about Joff? She paused, a shudder passing through her. He's not dead yet, is he? Ned closed his eyes, hearing her voice crack. She had once been betrothed to that boy. I don't know, he answered honestly. But if the Faceless men continue their hunt, I suspect they will try again. She trembled, unsure if she felt relief or horror. Tomard cleared his throat. My lord, you hired those killers? His voice held a mixture of awe and fear. Ned hesitated, then nodded. I did what I had to save us. I'll not pretend pride in it. He tightened his grip on the reins. Let us go. Every moment we linger is a chance for them to find us. We'll ride hard. Sansa, you must endure. I will, she whispered, eyes determined despite her exhaustion. So they rode. The King's Road stretched north, winding toward the riverlands. They passed peasants fleeing in carts, the Akkas, Ional patrol of soldiers who looked at them with suspicion but did not attempt to stop them once Ned introduced himself as the Lord of Winterfell. Many had heard rumors of a Stark host gathering in the north. Some even seemed glad to see him, if only because they believed his presence meant an end to Lannister tyranny. Yet Ned worried every step of the journey. Every time they reached an inn, he feared that the Lannisters would be there waiting, or that some new threat would pounce. At night, he barely slept, haunted by the memory of the throne room, Joffrey's startled face, and the swirl of that faceless man's sword. Sansa, for her part, grew wan and quiet, seldom speaking unless spoken to. The reality of her shattered illusions weighed heavily on her. Sometimes Ned would hear her crying softly in her sleep, and it tore at his heart. After nearly 2 weeks, they arrived in the Riverlands, which was scarred by small skirmishes. Bandits roamed, and displaced small folk hovered in makeshift camps. They encountered refugees who told stories of battles near the Twins, of Robb Stark winning victories against the Lannisters, capturing Jaime himself at the Whispering Wood. That news gave Ned a spark of hope. If Jaime was in Robb's custody, then one of the names on the Faceless men's list was effectively neutralized. But the rest he did not know. Perhaps the job was moot. Perhaps the Lannisters would seek terms. Yet he suspected that after the events in King's Landing, The Lannisters would be out for blood, more determined than ever to crush House Stark. One chilly morning, as they traveled along a wooded trail, they heard hoofbeats behind them. Tomard urged the group to move faster, but the sound approached too quickly. Soon, a lone rider came into view, clad in a dark leather cloak. Ned's heart lurched, expecting a Lannister scout. But the rider slowed, then raised empty hands to show no threat. "Lord Stark," the rider called in a woman's voice, sounding fatigued. She drew closer, lowering the hood. Ned recognized a sharp, angular face with short, dark hair. He did not know this woman personally, but he sensed the same unsettling aura that accompanied the Faceless men. She reined in her horse, which was lathered with foam from hard riding. "What is it?" Ned asked, voice guarded. Tomard had his hand on his sword hilt, eyes wary. "News," said the woman. "The many-faced god has taken your gold. The tasks you set forth are partially complete. The queen remains elusive. The boy king is heavily guarded, but the attempt has driven him to paranoia. The dwarf is rumored to be returning to King's Landing, having departed the field. The Kingslayer is captive. If you wish all Lannisters' name to be ended, that will require more time and more coin." Ned exhaled, his mind swirling. Did he truly want them all dead now? War was upon them. If Jaime was a prisoner, perhaps justice could be served through more legitimate means, like a proper trial or an exchange for his daughters. But then again, if the Lannisters regrouped, if Joffrey solidified his hold on the throne, House Stark could still be in mortal peril. "I will pay what I promised," he said at last, though each word felt like a stone in his chest. "But not yet. I must speak with my son, see how we can gather the gold. And we must discuss if we still want this done." The woman's expression did not change. "You engaged the many-faced god. Payment is owed, or blood is owed. If you forfeit now, there will be consequences." Ned looked away, pained. He thought of how the Faceless men were said to punish those who tried to cheat them. "I do not mean to cheat you. I only need time to consult with my family." She studied him, eyes dark, then inclined her head. "Time. For now. We will watch. When you are ready to finalize matters, we will come." She turned her horse to leave, but paused. "If you wish to name others, or to remove names from the list, you must also pay." With that, she spurred her horse and galloped away, leaving Ned and his party in an uneasy silence. Tomard let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Gods preserve us, my lord, but we have made a deal with devils." Ned said nothing, though he silently agreed. The moment he had scrawled that letter, he had opened the door to a darkness he was uncertain he could shut. They pressed on, searching for Robb Stark's host, which was reported to be moving through the Riverlands. The first sign they found were pickets wearing the direwolf sigil, who challenged them. At the sight of Ned, the pickets could scarcely believe their eyes. Rumors had placed him dead or imprisoned in King's Landing. As soon as they realized it was indeed Lord Stark, they escorted him swiftly to Robb's war camp. The reunion with his son was bittersweet. Robb embraced Ned fiercely, relief shining in his eyes, but the burden of command had weighed on the young man's shoulders. He stood a head taller than before, face hardened. He was not the same boy Ned had left in Winterfell. Catelyn was also there, having joined Robb's camp after negotiating with the Freys. When she saw Ned and Sansa enter the camp, she rushed forward, tears streaming, wrapping them both in a fierce embrace. Sansa clung to her mother, sobbing anew. Catelyn stroked her hair, murmuring comforting words. She looked over Sansa's shoulder at Ned, eyes full of questions. Where was Arya? How had they escaped? What had happened? Ned's voice shook as he told them only the bare outlines. King's Landing was in chaos. Joffrey had tried to execute him. The city erupted, and he fled. He kept the matter of the Faceless men vague, not wanting to speak of it in front of the assembled soldiers. But Catelyn's sharp eyes caught the hesitation, and she said, "We shall speak more privately, my lord." They retreated to Robb's command tent, where Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, and other northern lords gave them space. Sansa was taken to a quiet corner by a kind septa who had joined the host. Then Ned told Catelyn, Robb, and a few trusted advisors the whole story, from the deal he made with the Faceless men to the assault on the throne room. They listened in stunned silence. Robb's face turned pale, and Catelyn's lips thinned, her eyes glittering with worry. At length, Roose Bolton spoke with a calm veneer. "This is an interesting development, my lord. To have the Faceless men as your hired knives is not something many can boast. But it is dangerous, too." His quiet tone unsettled Ned, reminding him that the Dreadfort Lord also had a reputation for cunning cruelty. Catelyn pressed her fingers to her temples. "Oh, Ned, what have we done?" She glanced at him, sorrow in her gaze. "You did this for our family, I know. But to kill a boy king, this is no better than what the Lannisters did to the Targaryen children. If it becomes known that House Stark employed assassins, the realm may never forgive us." Ned felt shame coil in his chest, but he lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I tried to do what was right and nearly lost my head. They forced my hand." "We can't turn back time," Robb said, jaw clenched. "But what do we do now? Jaime is our prisoner. If Joffrey falls, Tyrion might become regent, or Cersei might cling to power somehow. Or Tywin Lannister might rally his forces in the west. We have to consider the possibility of a negotiated settlement." Ned's lips twitched in distaste. "After they threaten to kill me, after they hold my daughter Arya's fate in the balance? The Lannisters will not negotiate fairly." Robb exchanged a glance with Catelyn. "Mother has a plan for Jaime. We had considered trading him for Sansa and Arya. But with Sansa already here, that changes things." Catelyn nodded. "We must still get Arya back. The Lannisters swear they don't have her, but I don't trust a word they say. If the Faceless men continue their efforts, it may only enrage the Lannisters further." Ned took a deep breath. "I can attempt to call off the hits, but that might just as easily anger the Faceless men. They demand payment in full, or they will come for us." A silence fell. The gravity of this predicament weighed on them all. At length, Roose Bolton spoke again. "My lord, perhaps we can use them to our advantage. If Tywin Lannister is the true power behind the throne, removing him might yield a swifter end to this war. Felling Joffrey is symbolic, but Tywin is the real threat. The queen and the boy might be mere figureheads." Ned closed his eyes briefly, feeling as though he was trapped in a labyrinth of moral compromise. The deeper we go, the more we become like them. But he could not deny that removing Tywin Lannister would be a devastating blow to the other side's war effort. Catelyn touched his arm. "We must be practical, Ned. Winterfell is at stake, our children are at stake. This is no longer a simple matter of honor. War cares little for honor when the other side has none." Ned opened his eyes, saw the resolve in his wife's face, the desperation in his son's. He felt no triumph, only a cold acceptance. "Very well. If we can ensure Arya's safety, if we can end this war quickly, perhaps we can see peace for the North." They agreed to consult among the other northern lords, but keep the matter of the Faceless men strictly secret. If it leaked that House Stark had stooped to hiring Braavosi assassins, they risked losing the moral high ground. The realm was already fracturing, with Renly Baratheon declaring himself king in the south, and Stannis Baratheon claiming rightful kingship by law. Amidst that chaos, the North sought only independence or a fair settlement. Over the following days, they sent out scouts, consolidated their forces, and debated strategies. Ned wrote a carefully worded letter to the Braavosi contact he had used before, indicating a desire to either redirect or renegotiate the terms of the contract. He offered the possibility of naming new targets instead of Joffrey, emphasizing Tywin Lannister as a far more crucial figure. He also pressed for the location of Arya, or for the assassins to discover it as part of the deal. They waited for a reply, though no raven arrived bearing such a letter. Ned half expected another masked figure to appear in camp one night, stepping from the shadows to deliver instructions. But no one came. Instead, they received tidings of war. Tywin Lannister was marching with a large host, seeking to relieve Harrenhal or attack the Riverrun forces. Renly Baratheon had been killed under mysterious circumstances, fueling tales of dark magic in the south. Stannis was rumored to be preparing a fleet. Joffrey still sat the Iron Throne, though word was that he'd grown paranoid, rarely appearing in public. At last, on a foggy morning, while Ned was reviewing some Outriders' reports with Robb, a guardsman hurried into the command tent. "My lord, there's a messenger here, but he—" The guard hesitated, unsettled. "He just appeared." None of the sentries saw him ride up. Ned and Robb exchanged a look. "Bring him in," Ned said. The guard nodded, stepping out. Moments later, a stooped man in a ragged traveler's cloak entered. His face was lined with wrinkles, a few white wisps of hair escaping from beneath a hood, and he leaned on a staff. He looked every bit the image of an old beggar, but Ned suspected it was yet another borrowed face. "Greetings, Lord Stark," the old man said, voice quavering like a feeble elder. Yet the eyes that peered out from beneath bushy eyebrows were far too sharp. "Speak," Ned said, dismissing the guards so that only Robb and a few trusted men remained. "We have an answer for you. Tywin Lannister is in the field, gathering strength. If you wish him gone, that is feasible though challenging. He is not easily approached. There would be a cost in gold. But there is also another approach. You asked about your missing daughter, Arya. We have learned that she fled the Red Keep the day your troubles began. She has been seen traveling with recruits of the Night's Watch, a man named Yoren. As far as we can tell, she is alive and heading north, though trouble may find her on the way." Relief flared in Ned's chest. So Arya was free of the Lannisters' clutches. But that meant she was out in the war-torn countryside, vulnerable. "Can you protect her?" he asked, half despising himself for asking such a thing of these killers. The old man's grin showed missing teeth. "We do not protect. We deliver the gift of death. That is our art." Ned's relief soured. "Then at least do not harm her. If any of your brethren cross her path, see that they do not interfere. She is not to be touched." The man nodded once. "As you wish. Concerning the rest, time grows short. The many-faced god demands resolution." His quavering voice hardened slightly. "Your war spreads. If you no longer require our services to kill the Boy King or the Queen, if you wish to redirect our efforts to Tywin, that can be arranged for an additional sum." Ned felt an ache in his head. "And if I wish to call off the entire contract?" The man's eyebrows rose. "Then you must pay the price. We do not revoke a name lightly. For names you gave, partial attempt was made. The job is undone, but the coin was spent. A price in gold or blood must be met." Robb spoke up, voice tight with suppressed anger. "You deal in murder for gold. If my father pays you for nothing, what stops you from murdering him next and taking your spoils anyway?" The man turned his piercing gaze upon Robb. "We are not cutthroats for petty whim, young wolf. We serve a higher calling. Our word is binding. The coin is not mere coin, but an offering to the many-faced god. If your father meets his obligations, we shall trouble him no more." A tense silence filled the tent. Ned glanced at Robb, then back at the old man. "And if we continue, if we name Tywin instead of Joffrey, you must pay for the change. And if you still wish to see Joffrey fall, that remains the original contract. Additional names cost extra." Ned's stomach felt knotted. This was an entirely different kind of politics, a deadly commerce he had never imagined dealing in. He recalled the dead men in King's Landing, the sword flashing in the throne room. "We may need time to muster that much gold. We are at war and cannot simply conjure a fortune." The old man shrugged. "That is your concern, not ours. I can give you a fortnight's grace. After that, if no arrangement is reached, the many-faced god will come for payment in another form." Ned ground his teeth. "Very well. We will have your answer within a fortnight." "Good." The old man bowed stiffly, then shuffled out of the tent, staff tapping on the ground. When Ned walked outside moments later to see where the messenger had gone, the man was nowhere in sight. The guards insisted they had seen no one leave. The arrival and departure had been as silent as a cat. As the tension in the camp settled once more, Catelyn joined them, and Ned explained the ultimatum. She shook her head, distressed. "We can't just keep buying murders, Ned. There must be a better way." Robb's eyes were stormy. "But if it means stopping Tywin and saving thousands of lives that would be lost in open battle, might it not be worth it? I never asked to be a king or a warlord. I want to defend the North, not burn the realm." Roose Bolton's quiet voice cut in. "A single dagger can sometimes achieve more than 10,000 swords." Some of the lords murmured in agreement. Others looked uneasy. The Great John frowned, preferring open battle, but he too recognized the advantage. Ned stood caught between moral revulsion and paternal duty. He had started down this dark road, and each step seemed to pull him further from the honor he once prided himself on. Yet if he refused, the Faceless men might turn on him or worse, come for someone he loved. And the war would rage on, with the Lannisters unleashing horrors of their own. After a long pause, he said, "We will decide soon. For now, keep this matter between the few of us in this room. Robb, see to the dispositions of our forces. Roose, gather what coin we can. I'll speak with the others. I will not risk our entire cause by revealing this arrangement. We must be as cunning as the Lannisters, I fear." They dispersed, leaving Ned and Catelyn alone. She looked at him with sorrow, resting her hand on his shoulder. "I know this weighs on you terribly." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. "Every day I wonder if I should have let them take my head. At least my conscience would be intact." She closed her eyes. "We need you. Our children need you. The North needs you. I know you didn't want this." In the hush of that moment, Ned realized how far he had come from the man who rode south with a heart full of ideals. Yet the memory of Sansa's near execution, Arya's precarious flight, and the possibility of House Stark's annihilation steeled him. He would do whatever was necessary to keep his family safe, even if it meant harnessing the darkest tools in the world. 1 fortnight. That was the time the Faceless men had given him. Soon, he would have to make a final choice, to pay them to continue their lethal campaign or pay them to withdraw. Either option would be as fraught with peril as the other. The wheel of war kept turning, and Eddard Stark, once an honorable lord of the North, found himself an unwilling player in a game of masks, faces, and blood. He could almost hear the old gods whispering in the rustle of the wind. There is no turning back. Eddard Stark stood outside Robb's command tent in the damp morning air, staring out across the makeshift camp. Men in northern colors moved among cook fires, horses stamped their hooves, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang in rhythmic clangs. But Ned scarcely heard any of it. A fortnight, that was all the time the Faceless men had granted him to decide the future course of their bloody contract. It weighed on his heart like a stone, and he felt as though he were teetering on the brink of a precipice, each choice leading to a darkness from which there might be no return. He thought of the children he'd tried to protect. Sansa was safe for now, though haunted by terror-filled memories she could not easily set aside. Arya was somewhere on the King's Road North, disguised perhaps, traveling with the Night's Watch recruit party. At least she was free of Cersei's grip, but that was scant consolation when the roads were rife with bandits, soldiers, and the chaos of a realm in war. Bran and Rickon remained at Winterfell, out of immediate danger if the fighting didn't spill north. Robb was forging his destiny as the new leader of the northern host, the so-called king in the north to some of his bannermen, though the title had not been formally offered. And Jon Snow was far away on the wall, beyond Ned's help or guidance. He set aside such reflections for now, straightened his shoulders, and made his way through rows of tents to join his son and the Council of Northern Lords. As he walked, he heard men greet him quietly. Some called him "my lord." But there was a new hush of awe in how they spoke. Word had spread that he'd escaped King's Landing in a storm of blood. Stories had grown in the telling, and more than a few men whispered that dark magic or strange allies had aided him. Ned kept his face carefully still. The truth was not so different from the rumors, though he prayed no one would ever learn precisely how he had turned the tide. When he reached Robb's tent, the guards parted to admit him. Inside, he found Robb, tall in his mail and leather, eyes still bright with youthful intensity. Catelyn was there as well, pacing. Also present were Roose Bolton with his pale, unreadable face, and the great Jon Umber, so massive he dwarfed the others, his stance restless as though ready to do battle at the slightest excuse. A few of the other lords milled at the edges, waiting to hear the next piece of news. Catelyn approached Ned and touched his arm. "Any word?" He shook his head. "No messenger, no sign of them." Robb cleared his throat. "We've had a raven from Riverrun," he said. "My grandfather is holding strong, but Tywin Lannister has consolidated a sizable force near Harrenhal. They're harrying Tully lands. Our outriders say Tywin might be moving to intercept us if we push deeper into the Riverlands." He paused, jaw set. "We have an advantage with Jaime Lannister as our prisoner, but if Tywin decides to risk all in a pitched battle, he might retake his son by force. If we fight Tywin head-on, we risk heavy losses." Ned nodded wearily. "And we cannot afford to lose half our strength. The Lannisters still hold King's Landing, for all that chaos within it. Joffrey remains king in name, so their claim carries weight. The City Watch, the houses sworn to the crown, they could rally at any time." The Great Jon slapped a massive hand on a wooden table, making the cups on it jump. "Then let us call the banners, my lord. Gather every sword we can muster from the north and crush these lions once and for all." Roose Bolton's eyes flicked to Ned. "A grand assault might lead to devastation on both sides. If we bide our time, or if we remove Tywin with subtler means." Ned stiffened, hearing the subtext. He had already confided to a handful of them, Catelyn, Robb, Roose, a few others, that he had, in desperation, engaged Braavosi killers. But none of them could speak of it openly, lest it sow fear or revulsion among the men. The Northmen might accept bloody battle as honorable, but few would condone hiring hidden assassins who changed faces. Robb gave his father a questioning look. Ned realized they all waited on him to decide. The younger men had grown used to taking Ned's counsel, and Robb himself, while praised as king in the north by some, still yearned for his father's guidance. Catelyn's gaze was heavy with concern. Ned drew a slow breath. "We cannot simply rush forward and break ourselves upon the Lannisters, nor can we cower behind moats and walls while Tywin marauds. A smaller, strategic engagement might be best, and if Tywin were removed from command, it might force the rest to negotiate. But only if we can ensure the safety of our people." The Great Jon folded his massive arms. "If Tywin's head ends up on a spike, who leads the Lannisters then? The boy? The queen? The dwarf? None have Tywin's cunning. We'd have the advantage." Ned's chest tightened with the terrible knowledge of just how that might happen. He glanced at Catelyn. She looked back at him, resigned. "We should weigh every option," she said softly. Roose Bolton's pale lips curved in a polite, perfunctory smile. "Weigh them quickly, my lord. Tywin does not rest." They spoke a while longer about troop movements, supply lines, and the precarious alliances with certain riverlords. The Great Jon and Bolton traded suggestions for ambushes, while Catelyn reminded them of how Walder Frey might tilt the balance if he decided to be more cooperative, or more treacherous. Finally, Ned declared the council ended so that they could rest and reflect. The lords departed, leaving Ned with Robb and Catelyn. Robb ran a hand through his auburn hair, shoulders tense. "I'll speak to our quartermasters. We'll need to march soon, if only to keep Tywin from attacking Riverrun unopposed." When he'd gone, Catelyn moved closer to Ned, her voice low. "Have you made your decision about the Faceless men?" He closed his eyes. "I'm still uncertain. I see the argument. If they manage to kill Tywin, we might avert a long, bloody war. But these dealings, Cat, it's black treachery. And what if they fail or only wound him? The Lannisters will suspect us. This war could become a slaughter." Catelyn sighed, resting her head against his shoulder. "This war is a slaughter already. The best we can do is end it swiftly. But I won't urge you either way. If there's any chance we can end the contract without making things worse, I might prefer that. It shames me to think we're stooping to the same methods the Lannisters would use." He put an arm around her. "We'll have the gold soon, from the ransoms we've collected and the plunder we seized from Lannister foraging parties. That's not the problem. The problem is my conscience." He gave a bitter laugh. "I never imagined I would be in a place where coin and murder were my best weapons." She squeezed his hand. "Try to rest, Ned." That night, Ned slept little. He went to Sansa's tent, sitting with her as she dozed fitfully. She would wake from nightmares, stammering about Joffrey and the heads on the walls or the sudden violence in the throne room. He'd hush her as he used to hush her when she was a little girl frightened of storms. The guilt never ceased gnawing at him. He had unleashed a storm of his own. In the early gray of dawn, he rose and walked among the men again, silent and grim. They would march soon. He could sense it in the air. Soldiers were bundling up tents, packing supplies, hitching horses to wagons. He noticed how their eyes followed him, saw respect but also something like fear. He realized that many rumors must still be swirling. Perhaps they believed he'd bargained with demons. Perhaps they simply found it miraculous he still lived after being Joffrey's prisoner. In any case, they stepped aside for him as he passed. He was considering returning to his tent when he felt an odd sensation, a prickle along the back of his neck. He turned and spotted a man in a ragged cloak standing by a supply wagon. The moment Ned looked, the man slipped away. Ned's heart thumped. Was it one of the Bravosi? He followed, weaving between men in half-assembled lines, but the cloaked figure was too quick. By the time Ned reached the edge of the camp, he was gone. 2 days later, the northern host began its march. They headed deeper into the riverlands, passing burnt farms and fields turned to muddy battlegrounds. Now and then, Ned's outriders found pockets of Lannister men raiding or terrorizing the small folk. Each time, the northern cavalry scattered the raiders with quick violence. Ned allowed the Great John and others to handle such engagements, choosing to remain near Robb and the main force, guiding them with measured caution. He knew Tywin Lannister was too experienced a commander to be drawn into an open trap without a cunning plan of his own. On the 5th day of their march, they made camp near an old mill by a sluggish river. Broken mill wheels lay scattered on the bank. The night sky was shrouded in low-hanging clouds. Around midnight, Ned stood outside Robb's command tent, looking at the flickers of torches reflected on the water. He heard footsteps approach. Turning, he saw a figure with a staff, a familiar stooped shape. The old man who had come to them before. Ned signaled for the guards to stand down. They glanced at him nervously but obeyed. The old man halted, leaning on his staff, his breath puffing in the cool air. "It has been over a week since our last exchange, my lord. The many-faced god awaits your decision." Ned felt his pulse quicken. "You waste no time. We still have days left in your promised fortnight." "Yes," the man said. "But if you wish Tywin Lannister gone, we must make our preparations soon. He is a difficult quarry. We must position agents near him before he moves again." Ned's mouth felt dry. "And if I say I wish to end the contract completely?" The man's eyes, beneath the disguise of an aged face, glittered. "Then you must pay the forfeit." For names were given. The work was begun. Some of the coin was spent. The many-faced god does not offer refunds, Lord Stark, but retribution. A tense silence wrapped around them, broken only by the soft lap of the river. Ned thought about backing out. The war, the chance to recant this shadowy arrangement, to walk away from the guilt that choked him. But the threat was clear. If he withdrew now, House Stark might become the next target of these assassins. He was no fool. He recognized that once you invoked the Faceless men, they demanded their due. "What if I name only one target now?" Ned asked. "Tywin Lannister. That is the most crucial kill. Joffrey is still a boy for all his cruelty. He can be contained, forced to bend if his grandsire's power is gone. Or so I hope." He didn't mention how part of him still felt horror at the idea of murdering a child, no matter how vile. The old man considered. "We can reassign the contract to Tywin alone, but we must remove the others from the list. Each name withdrawn requires a sacrifice of gold. The total cost will be significant." Ned clenched his jaw. "We will pay. House Stark will pay whatever is needed. If you succeed, then our conflict may end faster. If you fail..." "We rarely fail," the man said calmly. "But yes, if we do, we will have fulfilled the attempt in good faith. That is all our order promises." Ned turned his gaze toward the smoldering silhouettes of tents and cooking fires. He thought of Robb, of the men who looked to him for leadership. If removing Tywin could save thousands of their lives, was it not worth it? The moral lines blurred once again under the necessity of war. "Very well," he said at last. "Arrange it, but do everything you can to avoid harming my family. If something goes wrong and the Lannisters retaliate, I need your assurance that you won't let them slip daggers into my wife or children. Our arrangement is with you, Lord Stark. We neither protect nor harm arbitrarily. If you fear for your children, best you keep them close. War is never safe." He nodded. "Then let's conclude. Tell me what you require." The old man named a staggering sum of gold, more than the original contract. Ned grimaced, but there was no room left for half measures. "We'll deliver half immediately and half upon confirmation that Tywin is dead." "That is acceptable." The man gave a brief bow. "We will proceed. Keep your army's ears open. When Tywin Lannister dies, the world will know, and we will come to collect." Ned's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword in an unconscious gesture of tension. "So be it." The old man pivoted on his staff and moved off into the darkness. The guards reported later that they saw nothing, heard no footsteps beyond a few paces from Ned, as if the night had simply swallowed him. That evening left Ned even more restless. He told Catelyn what he had done, how he had removed Joffrey, Cersei, and Tyrion from the list and replaced them with Tywin alone. Catelyn nodded, face tight. "It's probably for the best," she said, "though I wonder how the Boy King will respond if his grandfather suddenly falls. Perhaps Cersei will be too shaken to resist a truce, or chaos will erupt among their ranks. I don't know." He inhaled. "It's a risk, but a lesser one than slaughtering children." She pressed a hand to his cheek. "You've done what you must. I only pray it helps bring a swift end." 3 days later, Robb's outriders returned with urgent news. Tywin Lannister was on the move from Harrenhal, marching northward with a large army, likely to engage the Stark Tully forces. He had left a contingent behind to hold Harrenhal, but was leading the bulk of his host in a bold maneuver aimed at either relieving Jaime or attacking Robb, unaware, presumably, that Jaime was already a prisoner. In council, some argued to stand firm in open battle. Others suggested they withdraw beyond the twins, forcing Tywin to split his army if he wanted to pursue. Ned listened to the options, but in the back of his mind, he thought, the Faceless men will act soon. If they can strike Tywin in the midst of his own camp, the timing might be perfect. Roose Bolton, always measured, said, "If Tywin is marching, then his lines of supply are vulnerable. We could sow confusion, send small parties to burn his wagons, and retreat before he can pin us down. Meanwhile, we remain at a safe distance." The Great John snorted. "A coward's dance." Bolton's mild smile did not waver. "Perhaps, but a dance that would bleed Tywin's forces. If he is forced to spread out in foraging parties, we can pick them off." Robb looked to Ned. "Father," Ned cleared his throat, "I say we avoid a pitched battle unless we have the advantage. Our foot are weary, and we cannot match Tywin's cavalry in a direct charge. Harrenhal gave him time to rebuild, but keep him in sight. If he grows desperate, he may make a misstep." He did not speak of the assassin looming in Tywin's shadow. He could only hope that somewhere behind the lines, a faceless man prepared to strike. They followed a cautious strategy, marching parallel to Tywin's army at a safe distance, sending out swift cavalry to harry his supply lines. Skirmishes erupted across the riverlands. Fields burned, villages emptied, and refugees streamed in every direction. Soldiers from the Westerlands died in ambushes. Northern men died, too, cut off by Lannister outriders. War in all its brutality spilled over the land. Each night, Ned would lie awake, wondering if the next morning would bring news of Tywin's death. Yet day after day came and went with no such tidings. Tension mounted in the northern camp. Men began to complain that chasing Tywin across fields without a decisive engagement was cowardly. But Ned refused to commit to a rash battle. Robb supported him, though the Great John and other hot-headed lords chafed at the delay. Finally, after nearly a fortnight of maneuvering, word came that Tywin was encamped near an old fortress ruin, a minor keep left half-razed during Robert's rebellion. The land around it was barren, so foraging parties had to ride farther and farther for supplies. The stage seemed set for something to happen, but Ned had no illusions that it would be simple. Tywin Lannister did not make careless mistakes. In the early hours before dawn, Ned awoke to the distant thunder of hooves. He sat up, alarmed, and hurried out of his tent, sword belt buckled over his simple tunic. Soldiers were already stirring, peering into the gray gloom. A single rider galloped toward the Stark lines, bearing no banner. The watchman called out, and the rider slowed. Ned approached with caution. It was a youth in a tattered cloak, mud spattering his boots and horse. He pulled up short before the guard line and shouted, "I bring tidings for Lord Stark." Ned stepped forward, flanked by a squad of guards. "I am Ned Stark." The youth's cheeks were hollow from hard riding. "I come from a village 2 leagues west. Lord Tywin Lannister's men were there." He swallowed hard. "There was death in his camp last night. Talk among the soldiers says Tywin was nearly slain, but the old lion still breathes. They say an assassin got into his tent, killed 2 guards, wounded Tywin in the shoulder, but was driven off. Tywin Lannister lives." A cold tremor coursed through Ned. "Are you certain?" "Aye, my lord. That's the word from the men. They say Tywin's own guards found him covered in blood, with a dead man in black beside him. Stabbed in the eye, they claim. Now Tywin has doubled his security, and he's furious, swearing vengeance." Ned closed his eyes. The faceless man had tried and failed. Were there any more details? The youth shook his head. "Only that Tywin is packing up to march. They say he might come for your head next, my lord, because he suspects you're behind the attempt." Ned cursed under his breath. The tension in the camp erupted with an almost tangible wave of alarm as soldiers overheard the rider's words. If Tywin suspected the Starks of sending an assassin, this war might escalate further, and the lion would lash out in fury. He sent the youth off to the quartermaster for food and a place to rest, then turned to the knot of lords gathering around him. Robb was there, eyes wide. The Great John roared, "So that's it, is it? Some sneak thief tried to do our work for us and failed? Now the Lannisters will be thrice as vicious." Ned swallowed. "We have to prepare for a direct attack. Tywin may attempt to force a battle." He felt sick inside. All that gold, all that cunning, and the strike had failed. But the old man had said the faceless men rarely gave up after one attempt, unless they died. The youth's report of a black-clad corpse in Tywin's tent suggested that assassin had indeed perished. Would the Bravosi send another? Roose Bolton's voice was strangely calm. "We must reposition at once. If Tywin is furious enough to come at us, we can choose ground that favors us, perhaps near the fords of the Red Fork. Make him cross under arrow fire." Robb nodded, seizing on the idea. "Aye, or lure him into a trap as I did with Jaime at the Whispering Wood." "Father, what do you think?" Ned fought to push aside the swirling guilt. "Yes, find strong ground. Let's move. We can't linger here." Without further delay, they gave the command to break camp and move upriver. The northern host marched quickly, but a sense of dread dogged them. At midday, outriders reported that Tywin's force was indeed marching directly toward them, and it was large thousands of men. Tywin had recalled his foraging detachments, sweeping the countryside for any additional levies he could muster. His anger was stirring him to act boldly. Ned, Robb, and their lords found a position near a bend of the Red Fork where the ground rose to a low ridge. They stationed archers on the slope, pikes behind sharpened stakes, and cavalry hidden in a nearby grove. With luck, if Tywin attacked head-on, he might break against their lines. But Tywin Lannister was no fool. When his outriders spotted the prepared position, he halted out of range. By evening, neither side had committed, though the armies faced each other across fields of tall grass, close enough to see the torchlight in the enemy camp. The tension was a drawn bowstring. In the Stark camp, men sharpened swords and whispered of what would come with the dawn. Sansa stayed in a protected area to the rear, guarded by men sworn to Ned. Catelyn moved among the lords, offering counsel. Robb stood with Ned, staring across the twilight plain at the distant fires of Tywin's host. "He might wait us out," Robb said. "Try to starve us of supplies, or force us to attack him." Ned grimaced. "He might, or he might test us at first light." They parted to see to final preparations. Ned intended to catch a few hours of rest, but the very idea of sleep seemed impossible. He paced at the edge of camp, near a stand of poplar trees. The night was oppressive, heavy with the smell of damp earth and fear. Behind him, the torches burned around the tents. He thought of the Faceless men again. If one had died, would they send another? Or would they demand even more payment? A whisper of movement caused him to turn sharply. There, emerging from the shadows beneath the poplars, stood a woman clad in tight-fitting black leathers, her face half hidden by a scarf. Ned tensed. He knew that posture, that quiet. Another faceless man, faceless woman more accurately, though he knew that might be a disguise too. "You hired us," the woman said in a low, measured voice. "We have come to fulfill what was promised." Ned tried to keep his voice steady. "Your first attempt failed. I heard your man was killed." Her eyes glinted in the torchlight. "Yes, he died well. We do not fail lightly, but Tywin Lannister is watchful. Now he is more guarded than before. But we have not given up. You have asked for his death. We intend to deliver it." He ran a hand over his face. "But the cost? Must I pay more?" He expected them to demand further extortion. She inclined her head. "We have lost one of our own. The many-faced god requires another offering. If you still wish Tywin to die, you must pay for a second attempt." A surge of anger sparked in him. "I've paid a fortune already. A second attempt, a second price. Or we can consider the matter ended. And House Stark will face the consequence of reneging on a contract." Ned's stomach twisted. He had run out of illusions about extricating himself. "How high is the price this time?" She named a figure that made his breath catch. "More than the entire treasury at Winterfell could muster." Ned thought of the gold that might be extorted from the Lannisters if they won the war, or from the southern lords they could ransom. Still, it was nearly beyond reason. "You're bleeding us dry," he said, voice raw. Her gaze never wavered. "This is not a negotiation. If you refuse, the contract is broken. And for that, the many-faced god will claim a different payment." She let the words hang ominously. Ned looked around, seeing the silhouettes of northern men, the shapes of their tents. These were his people. He could not risk the faceless men turning their blades on his own side. "Very well," he said quietly. "But your agent must succeed this time." Her eyes, cold and unreadable, gleamed. "We will do our utmost. But Tywin is a formidable target. We cannot promise the hour, only that the job will be done, or we will die trying." "Gods have mercy," Ned muttered. She stepped forward, extending a cloth pouch. "This is for you, the face of our fallen brother. Keep it if you doubt our commitment. We rarely leave such relics behind, but let it remind you that we do not abandon a contract lightly." Ned recoiled, refusing to take the pouch. He did not want to see whatever horror lay within. The woman tilted her head, then quietly slipped it back into her belt. "As you will." He forced himself to speak. "We meet Tywin in battle tomorrow or soon after. If you can strike him in the chaos, do so. But please, my men, my son, do not cause them harm." A faint nod. "We kill who we must. No more, no less." Then she melted back into the shadows, leaving Ned's heart pounding in his ears. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to push down the horror of their ultimatum. In the distance, he could sense the presence of Tywin's army, as if it were a great beast hunched in the night. War was about to be unleashed, and the outcome felt more uncertain than ever. Dawn broke gray and cold. Ned stood on the ridge with Robb, the Greatjon, and other commanders. They could see Tywin's banners across the fields, crimson and gold lions shining in the pale light. Drums sounded, horns brayed, and men formed ranks. It appeared Tywin meant to test them after all. The battle began with a thunder of hooves as a Lannister cavalry detachment charged the Stark pickets. Archers on the ridge loosed volleys of arrows, and the cavalry retreated under the stinging shafts. Ned tensed, searching for a sign of Tywin himself. But from this distance, it was impossible to spot one man among thousands. For a time, Tywin's forces probed along the lines, seeking a weakness. The northern archers and spear walls held firm. Shouts rang out, steel clashed. Here and there, men screamed and fell. Ned felt the old dread settle over him. He had fought in Robert's rebellion, had seen too much blood. He did not want to see more, but the realm gave him no choice. As midday approached, Tywin unleashed his main thrust. A broad column of infantry advancing on the center, flanked by heavy cavalry. The Greatjon roared a challenge, ordering the pikes to brace. It was a brutal clash, men hacking at each other among the stakes. The ground turned muddy with blood. Ned fought alongside them, sword in hand. Though the press of bodies was so thick, he could do little but defend himself. Somewhere to the north flank, Robb commanded a cavalry maneuver, hoping to encircle the attackers. Ned could not see how that progressed. The din was overwhelming, shouts, horns, the ring of steel. At one point, a Lannister knight barreled into Ned, swinging a morning star that nearly cracked his helm. Ned parried, felt his arms shake with the impact, then managed a thrust that caught the knight's horse in the flank. The horse screamed, toppling, and the knight crashed down to be finished by northern spearmen. In the swirl of combat, Ned glimpsed men in strange garb, a handful wearing black hoods or unmarked armor, weaving among the fighting. At first, he thought they were Lannister brigands or some free company. Then he realized they fought with unnatural grace. One of them slid behind a Lannister bannerman and stabbed him swiftly in the back, then vanished. Another soared over the press of men, flipping in a way Ned would have thought impossible in armor. He realized these had to be faceless men. More than one, perhaps half a dozen, scattered across the battlefield. The cost must have been even greater than he'd known. They were risking everything to kill Tywin. For a brief, wild moment, he wanted to cry out for them to stop. This was madness. Yet he steeled himself, reminding himself of all the heartbreak House Stark had endured. If Tywin fell, perhaps the Lannister forces would crumble. The fighting raged, disorganized. The smell of blood and sweat filled Ned's nostrils. At last, he managed to fight his way back to the ridge, calling for a regroup. Bodies littered the slope. The Lannister assault had stalled, but they were regrouping in the fields below. A messenger dashed up to Ned, panting. "My lord, the center holds, but the left flank is threatened. They're bringing up archers and crossbowmen to pepper us. Lord Bolton says we must shift reserves or risk collapse." Ned scanned the chaos. "Where is Lord Tywin?" "The scouts say he's commanding from a vantage near that copse of trees on the far side. Well guarded. They can see his banner there. A golden lion on red." Ned followed the messenger's pointing finger. Indeed, through the haze of dust and arrow smoke, he could make out a cluster of lion banners. Was Tywin among them, or was that just a ruse? Another wave of Lannister infantry began to surge forward, pushing toward the slope. Ned directed some of his battered men to form a shield wall near the base of the ridge, then motioned for the messenger to find Roose Bolton. He ordered him to shift the cavalry reserves to the left. The messenger ran off, ducking arrows. As the lines clashed again, Ned caught more glimpses of those black-clad assassins in the swirling mass. They were edging toward that copse, as if homing in on Tywin's position. But Tywin's men were numerous, and the swirl of combat made it impossible to slip through unnoticed. Two of the faceless men fell under a fusillade of crossbow bolts. Ned saw them drop, rolling into the brush, uncertain if they were dead or merely wounded. The hours bled together in a cacophony of violence. At times, the Starks seemed to be holding well. At others, They looked to be on the brink of collapse as Lannister cavalry hammered the flanks. Ned found himself in personal combat more than once, hacking through spearmen who lunged at him with shouts of, "For the lion!" His arms ached, his vision blurred with sweat. The only constant was the horrifying churn of blood and mud underfoot. By late afternoon, both sides had fought themselves into a stalemate. The field was strewn with bodies, and the setting sun cast a lurid glow over the carnage. At last, horns sounded from the Lannister side, signaling a withdrawal. The battered remnants of Tywin's army pulled back to the distant tree line, forming a defensive perimeter. The Stark men were too exhausted to give chase. Ned collapsed onto a rock near the ridge, panting, as a squire brought him water. He drank greedily, scanning the torn battlefield. Robb appeared on horseback, his face splattered with grime, eyes blazing with adrenaline. "Father, we've held them off, but at a cost. Lord Serwyn fell. The Greyjohns wounded. How fare we here?" Ned tried to focus. "We held, but Tywin might attack again tomorrow. Our losses are heavy." He hesitated. "No sign of Tywin's death?" Robb shook his head, not grasping the undertone. "He must still be out there. They wouldn't retreat otherwise, I wager. Perhaps they took more losses than they expected." Ned silently cursed. The Faceless men had not succeeded, or if they had, the Lannisters would be in disarray, not calmly withdrawing in good order. Tywin still lived. Another attempt had failed or was still in progress. They spent the night treating the wounded and fortifying their position. Sansa helped the camp healers, holding bandages and fetching water. Ned saw her pale face as she watched men cry out in pain, and he could do nothing but silently curse the necessity of bringing her on a campaign. It was no life for a girl of her age, but there was no truly safe place anymore. Toward midnight, Ned ventured beyond the outer sentries, scanning the darkness. If the Faceless men roamed, he wanted some sign of them. Finally, beneath a half-burned oak tree, he spotted a figure slumped on the ground, a black cloak soaked in blood. His heart jumped. Could it be one of them? He carefully approached, sword drawn. The figure stirred, turning a masked face toward him. A man's face, or perhaps a woman's? It was impossible to tell, as the mask was made of some dark material. The voice was weak, gasping. "Lord Stark." Ned knelt cautiously. "Yes." A raspy chuckle, followed by a cough that sprayed blood. "We found him, but his guard was too strong. We cut down 4 knights, but one got me with a spear thrust. Tywin, still, lives." The figure let out a shuddering breath, trying to rise. Ned saw the mortal wound in the assassin's side, the gush of blood that would not be stanched. Ned felt both pity and dread. "Don't move," he said, though it was futile advice. The man, if it was a man, was clearly dying. The assassin's gloved hand groped at Ned's tunic, pulling him closer. "We do not fail. Others will come. You must pay." The many-faced God! A wet rattle sounded in his throat. Then he went limp, mask dropping from his face to reveal an androgynous visage, eyes glazed over in death. Ned gently laid the assassin back, a swirl of numb despair washing over him. How many had the Faceless men lost trying to kill Tywin? And each failure demanded more gold, more blood. Tywin Lannister seemed unkillable, guarded by steel, cunning, and a ferocious will. Ned almost wished he had tried the same tactic on Joffrey after all. Joffrey might have been an easier mark. But Ned shuddered, recalling the Child King's face. Better this path if it would eventually prevent further tragedies. He closed the dead assassin's eyes, then slid the mask back over the lifeless features. The smell of blood hung thick in the air. In the dark, he prayed softly to the old gods. Then, steeling himself, he rose and walked back to camp, leaving the corpse to the silent night. When morning came, Tywin did not renew his attack. Instead, scouts reported that the Lannister host had broken camp, marching south with haste. The men seemed baffled by this retreat. Some suspected a ruse that Tywin might circle around for a flank attack. Others said the blow they dealt him was too great. Ned eyed the horizon uneasily. Perhaps Tywin recognized the battlefield was not in his favor, or perhaps events elsewhere demanded his presence. Robb decided to pursue cautiously, but the Lannisters were moving at a steady pace, never letting the Northerners catch them in a disadvantageous position. After 2 days of fruitless marching, the Northern force halted to regroup. Morale was low. Despite holding the field, they had suffered heavy casualties, and the men were weary of endless skirmishes. Ned, equally weary, gathered his top lords in a tent for council yet again. Roose Bolton tapped a map with pale fingers. They'll likely head toward Harrenhal or the Gold Road, refortify, then strike again. The Great John, nursing a bandaged leg, grumbled, "Let's chase them to the gates of Harrenhal and burn them out." Catelyn frowned. "We'd lose half our men assaulting Harrenhal's walls. That castle is near impregnable if well garrisoned." They were still discussing possible strategies when a commotion arose outside. One of the guards burst in. "My lords, a messenger is here. From King's Landing," he says, bearing a royal seal. Ned exchanged a startled look with Catelyn. "Show him in." A short man in tattered finery entered. His surcoat bore the Baratheon stag and the Lion of Lannister entwined, Joffrey's sigil. He bowed stiffly. "I come with an offer. A peace negotiation from King Joffrey Baratheon." Silence fell in the tent. The Great John spat on the ground. "Peace? The boy wants our heads on spikes." The messenger swallowed nervously. "He extends an invitation to Lord Eddard Stark, Lady Catelyn Tully, and your son, Robb Stark, to discuss terms in the town of Sharer along the Rose Road, under a banner of truce. He promises safe conduct." The letter bears the royal seal, as well as the hand's seal. "The Hand? Who is the Hand now?" Ned asked. "Lord Tyrion Lannister has been named Hand of the King," the messenger replied. Roose Bolton let out a soft snort, though he said nothing. Ned's mind raced. So Tyrion was now Hand, presumably to manage the kingdom while Tywin was in the field. But if Tywin had retreated, perhaps he'd decided his energies were better spent fortifying King's Landing. Or maybe Cersei had insisted Tyrion fill the role. In any case, it was a surprising twist. "And their terms?" Ned asked. "Nothing is set. They wish to propose an exchange of prisoners, Ser Jaime for your daughter Arya, if she is found, among others. Lord Stark's status would be restored, and the North allowed a measure of autonomy. Or so the letter suggests. You are invited to discuss the details in person, 2 fortnights hence." Skepticism rippled through the tent. "They want us to walk into a trap," the Great John growled. "It's the Lannister way." Catelyn folded her arms. "This might be a ploy to lure us away from our army, but if we refuse outright, it may harden their resolve. And we still want Arya safe." Robb rubbed his chin, looking to Ned. "Father, what do you think?" Ned felt conflicted. The mere idea of negotiating with Joffrey and Tyrion after all that had happened was galling. But if it meant a chance to secure Arya's future, or a chance to end the bloodshed, should he refuse? He thought of the secret war he was waging with the Faceless men. If Tywin was indeed pulled back to King's Landing, or lurking near Harrenhal, the assassins might still attempt to strike him. A peace negotiation might be moot if Tywin ended up dead and chaos erupted in the capital. Yet, if there was even a chance of a diplomatic resolution, of sparing thousands of lives, could he ignore it? He closed his eyes. "We'll consider the invitation. We have 2 fortnights to decide. Inform them we received the message." The messenger nodded, exhaling with relief. "Thank you, my lord. I'll take your response back on the morrow." After he left, Ned and the others debated hotly. Some demanded war without negotiation, others urged caution. In the end, it was decided they would gather more information before pledging to send an envoy. If the Lannisters were truly reeling from Tywin's wound and the heavy losses in the field, perhaps they sought a truce to buy time to recover. On the other hand, maybe it signaled real weakness, an opportunity for the North to press its advantage. But Ned, weighed down by secret knowledge, could not shake the sense that all these moves would be overshadowed by whether or not Tywin Lannister lived or died. He dreaded another confrontation with the Braavosi, Their attempts had failed twice. Would they keep sending assassins until their order was depleted? Or would they demand an even more staggering ransom to keep trying? That night, he settled in his tent with Catelyn, trying to rest. His body ached, his heart even more so. She sat beside him, her hair unbound, offering silent comfort. He whispered his fears, and she stroked his cheek. "We'll do what we must to protect our family. If it's war, then war. If it's peace, then peace. The gods help us." They fell into a troubled sleep. Near the hour of the wolf, Ned woke suddenly, a strange cold dread in his chest. He slipped outside the tent. The sky was clear, stars shimmering like distant shards of ice. He noticed a figure at the edge of the camp again, near a flickering torch. This time it was the old man with the staff. Ned approached warily. The figure did not run, only waited. Once more, Ned dismissed his guards with a look, for he did not want them to overhear. "Your people failed again," Ned said in a hushed, accusatory tone. "Twice over. Tywin still draws breath. How many more will die on your side and mine?" The old man's expression, if it was indeed an old man's at all, remained unmoved. "We do not shirk from death. Each attempt has come close, but Tywin is cunning. He has loyal men who guard him zealously. Still, we have other methods. There is poison. There are illusions. We will not stop unless you release us from the contract or unless Tywin falls." Ned clenched his fists. "Your price keeps increasing. We can't pay forever." "Then cut your losses and accept the consequences," the old man said, voice rasping. "We have lost several of our own. The many-faced god demands repayment for each, or Tywin's life to complete the offering." Silence stretched between them like a blade's edge. Ned thought of calling the entire deal off, accepting death if that was what it meant. But it would not be just his death. They might strike at Robb, Sansa, or any of the Starks. The thought made him ill. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. "You say you have other methods. Use them, but do not come to me for more gold. I have already pledged a fortune. If you fail again, let us end this madness." The old man cocked his head. "If we fail again, it will be the end for us, and for you. But we do not fail thrice. Tywin Lannister's hours are numbered." With that cryptic promise, the old man thumped his staff once on the ground and stepped back into the darkness. Ned let out a shaky breath, turning away. He felt as though he had been speaking to death itself. Days passed. Ned's army shadowed Tywin's, each marching within striking distance. The Lannisters seemed intent on reaching Harrenhal or perhaps the Blackwater. Skirmishes flared whenever outriders met, but Tywin did not risk a full engagement again. As the armies moved, ravens darted across the sky, carrying messages of new developments. One day, a raven arrived from the Vale, with rumors that Lisa Arryn might consider aiding the Starks, yet no firm pledge. Another told of fresh chaos in the capital. The city was restive with riots over food shortages. Then, one morning, their scouts reported that Tywin had turned sharply west, away from the Red Fork. It seemed he intended to bypass the main crossings and hurry toward the Gold Road. If he succeeded, he could link up with reinforcements from the Westerlands. Ned was torn. Chasing him into the Westerlands might be unwise. The northern host was ill-supplied for a long campaign away from the Riverlands. In a council of war, the Great John insisted they press on, harass Tywin all the way to Casterly Rock if needed. Roose Bolton demurred, urging caution. Robb looked to Ned for final direction. Ned weighed the risks. If Tywin reach Ed the shelter of his own lands, killing him would become even harder, no matter what the Faceless men tried. But leading the army deeper into hostile territory might be their undoing. In the end, Ned chose a middle course. They would follow Tywin at a distance, sending outriders to keep track of his movements, but not fully commit to an invasion of the Westerlands without more support. Catelyn supported this. She suggested they might hold certain strategic points in the Riverlands, forcing Tywin to come back if he wanted to break their line. As the days turned into another fortnight, the tension over the secret contract grew. The Braavosi did not appear. No urgent messages arrived announcing Tywin's demise. Each morning, Ned woke with a clenched heart, expecting word one way or another. But the war ground on day after day. Tywin marched, the Northmen followed. Each side waited for the other to make a fatal mistake. One evening, Ned sat in his tent with Robb, discussing the next day's march. A guard called from outside. "Lord Stark, a messenger is here demanding to see you." Ned's spine stiffened. He nodded to Robb and they both stood. Outside, they found a stranger in a cloak of drab gray, face half concealed under a heavy hood. The man's voice was strained. "My lord, I bring tidings from the west. Tywin Lannister has been found dead in his tent." A jolt like lightning ran through Ned. "Dead? How? When?" He barely trusted the words. The messenger wet his lips. "2 nights passed. It is said he took ill. Some men call it poison. Others say he was stricken with a sudden flux. But he died swiftly, they claim. He was discovered in the morning, foam on his lips. Word is spreading among the Lannister ranks. Already they're in disarray. The command is fractured between several of his bannermen. Some speak of retreating to defend the rock. Others talk of returning to King's Landing." A hush settled over the gathered men. Robb looked at Ned, shock etched on his young features. If Tywin is truly dead, that changes everything. Ned's heartbeat thundered in his chest. The old man's voice echoed in his mind. "We have other methods. Poison." So it had happened. The Faceless men had succeeded at last, in a quieter, more insidious way. He pressed the messenger for details, but the man had little more than rumors. Tywin had complained of stomach pains the previous night, grown feverish, and by dawn was dead. Lannister captains were scrambling for control, some wanting to continue the war, others too shaken to press forward. The news swept through the camp like wildfire. Northern men cheered, brandishing weapons and proclaiming that the great lion had fallen. Some questioned the manner of his death. It did not sound like the result of a normal sickness. Whispers of foul play spread in the ranks. The Great John roared that the old lion died like a dog, while other lords gave uneasy glances at each other. But none openly suggested that House Stark was behind it. Ned retreated to a private corner as men around him erupted in celebration. Robb was carried off by cheering soldiers. Catelyn found Ned standing at the edge of camp, staring at the horizon. She touched his arm gently. "It's done," she said. "If this is true, Tywin is gone." He let out a shaky breath, uncertain whether to feel relief or dread. Yes, now the war may change. The Lannister host might fracture, or they might fight even more viciously for vengeance. He looked at her, eyes dark with worry. "And the Faceless men will want their due." She nodded, lips pressed thin. "We'll give them what they're owed, and hope that ends it." Indeed, that night another messenger came, one more ominous than the rumored traveler. A lithe, slender figure approached Ned's tent, stepping inside without so much as a warning to the guards. Ned stood to confront this intruder, his hand on his sword. Then he recognized the fluid grace. Another Faceless man. Or woman. "It is done," she said, pulling down her hood to reveal an unremarkable face, hair cut short. "Tywin Lannister is dead by poison. One of ours was in his retinue, disguised as a camp follower. Your contract is complete. Now we come for the final payment." Ned's jaw tightened. "You'll have your gold, but I can't gather such a sum instantly. Give me time." She regarded him with those unervingly calm eyes. "We will give you 1 moon's turn. If after that time the gold is not delivered, we will collect in blood. This is the law." He nodded, though anxiety gnawed at him. 1 moon's turn. Understood. Where shall I send the gold? In 3 days' time you will receive instructions at dawn. Follow them precisely. No attempts at deceit or ambush. If you comply, our business is ended. She paused. Know that if we wish it, we could kill a dozen guards and vanish before the alarm is raised. But we come in peace to settle accounts. Ned swallowed. And if the gold is delivered properly, You swear House Stark will be safe from you?" She nodded once. "The many-faced god is paid, and the account is closed." He let out a slow breath. "Then I will see it done. Please, no harm to my family in the meantime. We have no reason to harm them, so long as you remain true to your word." She turned, then froze with a slight tilt of her head. "Unless there is one more matter." Ned's nerves prickled. "What matter?" She turned back. "We have an ear in King's Landing. It is rumored that Cersei Lannister is calling for your head, proclaiming you used black sorcery to murder her father. Tyrion Lannister, the new hand, is trying to keep the city from boiling over. But the Queen's rage is fierce. You should be wary." Ned nodded grimly. "I will be." With a final, unreadable stare, she left as quietly as she had come. Ned stood there in the wavering lamplight, feeling both immense relief that Tywin's shadow was finally gone and a deep foreboding for what might come next. One problem was solved, but new perils had emerged. Word of Tywin's death spread quickly through the Seven Kingdoms. In the days that followed, the Lannister army splintered. Some knights pledged loyalty to the next in line, Kevan Lannister or Tyrion if he returned to them. Others simply deserted, not wishing to fight on without the old lion's iron will. Ned's scouts reported that the Lannisters were in retreat, pulling back into the Westerlands or toward King's Landing. The field was open for the Northmen to reclaim key positions in the Riverlands, strengthen alliances, and possibly sue for peace from a position of advantage. Many lords exulted, convinced the war would soon end in a Stark victory. The Great John boomed that the Lannisters were done for, that Jaime should be dragged out and paraded in chains. But Ned, wiser in the ways of the realm's complexities, remained uneasy. He and Robb conferred with Catelyn, deciding how best to proceed. Jaime Lannister was still their prisoner at Riverrun, likely furious at news of his father's death. They might trade him for Arya if the girl was indeed in Lannister hands, but their spies still insisted she was traveling north, free of them. Sansa was safe. The realm's politics were shifting. Stannis was said to be gathering men at Dragonstone, and the Tyrells were rumored to be forging alliances in the south. King Joffrey clung to the Iron Throne, though his mother presumably guided him. Within 3 days, as promised, instructions arrived for the final payment to the Faceless men. A messenger, clad in plain gray, delivered a sealed parchment. It bore no sigil, only a faint watermark of a coin. Ned opened it to find precise directions. A hidden cove near Seaguard at midnight, with a directive to bring the required gold on a single ship. No more than 4 men were allowed to come. Any deviation or sign of treachery would forfeit House Stark's safety. Ned's close advisors balked at letting him sail off with a fortune in gold to meet shadowy killers. But Ned insisted, quietly explaining just enough that they understood the stakes. Robb demanded to accompany him. Catelyn argued that it was too dangerous, but Ned saw a certain sense in it. He would bring Robb plus Roose Bolton and a small retinue of 6 guards. The instructions said 4, but Ned reasoned they needed some muscle to carry the gold. The letter had said no more than 4 men besides the guards to row the boat. If the Faceless men wanted to object, they could say so at the cove. And so, in the hush before dawn one morning, they rowed out with wagons of gold concealed under tarps. Northerners loyal to Ned asked no questions, though rumors swirled that this was some secret negotiation for supplies. They traveled swiftly across the Riverlands to the coast near Seaguard, avoiding any large Lannister presence. The war had cooled in that region, so the journey was tense but unopposed. They reached Seaguard under cover of night, discreetly hiring a small trading vessel. The local Malisters were told only that Ned had urgent business across the bay. They loaded the gold onto the ship with care, each bar and chest making a dull clang that echoed across the wharf. Bolton accompanied them, his face as placid as ever, though Ned saw flickers of curiosity in his pale eyes. It must have intrigued him, this clandestine transaction. The boat launched into black waters. A few men handled the sails and oars, guiding them southward along the coast until they reached the designated cove, a rocky inlet screened by tall cliffs. At midnight, the moon was shrouded by clouds, giving the cove a ghostly pall. The boat slipped past jagged rocks, the men guided by lantern light. Eventually, they spied a faint glow on the shore, a single lantern swaying. Ned's heart hammered. They neared the beach, waves lapping at the pebbles. Figures stood waiting. Half a dozen or more, cloaked in black, with no banners or markings. The cove was eerily silent, save for the surf. The boat grounded on the shingle. Ned stepped off first, sword at his side, boots sinking into wet sand. Robb followed, tense, hand hovering near his own blade. Bolton came next, face inscrutable. Two of Ned's guards began unloading a chest of gold, straining under its weight. The other chests followed, stacked carefully on the beach. The rest of the men on the boat held the lanterns aloft, illuminating the scene in flickering light. The cloaked figures approached soundlessly. One stepped forward, a woman's shape if Ned guessed right. She inclined her head. "Lord Stark, you have the gold." Ned gestured at the chests. "Here it is. Count it if you wish." She signaled to a pair of her companions, who moved forward with surprising strength. They lifted the lids and began methodically checking the contents. The clang of gold echoed in the night. Robb cast anxious glances around, alert for a trap. Bolton stood quietly, his left hand resting on the hilt of a dagger. Ned himself felt every muscle taut, but he tried to appear calm. After a few minutes, the two examiners stepped back. One gave a small nod. The woman turned to Ned. "We find the gold acceptable. The account is closed. House Stark owes no more to the many-faced god." Ned let out a long breath. "Then our bargain is done?" She raised a hand. Another figure came forward, holding a small pouch. "We return this to you," the woman said, tossing the pouch lightly to Ned. He caught it by reflex. It was surprisingly light. He frowned. "What is it?" "Proof that we hold no interest in your family's destruction. Token. You once refused a similar item. Now keep it or cast it into the sea. It matters not to us, but know that we do not lie. Tywin Lannister is gone by our hand." She paused. "May we never do business again, Wolf of the North." Before Ned could respond, the hooded figures turned and vanished into the darkness of the rocky beach. Robb blinked, astonished at how swiftly they melted away. Even Bolton seemed startled. The only evidence of their presence was the footprints in the wet sand and the empty lantern left on a rock, flame guttering in the wind. Ned stood there, heart pounding. Carefully, he loosened the pouch's drawstring. Inside lay a single golden coin the size of his palm, stamped with an unfamiliar face on one side and a skull on the other. Some Braavosi token, he supposed. He felt a chill run through him, imagining the significance. Possibly a parting message that death had been purchased, the debt repaid. Robb exhaled. "They're gone. Gods be good, Father. I never want to meet them again." Bolton arched an eyebrow. "Our foes have lost their greatest general, thanks to unorthodox methods. Let's hope the realm finds peace soon." Ned shut the pouch, tucking it into his cloak. The significance of the moment weighed on him. The gold was gone. The arrangement was finished. No one had attacked them or demanded more. It was over, but the moral burden would never fully lift from his shoulders. He nodded to Robb. "We should leave." They returned to the boat. The men rowed out of the cove, the sea spray cold on their faces. Ned felt empty, as though the darkness of that transaction had hollowed him out. Robb said nothing, sensing his father's mood. They sailed back north under moonlight, leaving the blood price behind. Within days of that night, the effect of Tywin's death began to reshape the war. The Lannister forces split, some returning to the Westerlands to protect Casterly Rock, others heading to King's Landing, uncertain whom to follow. Tyrion struggled to keep the capital from erupting in civil strife. Cersei howled for vengeance, but no one seemed certain against whom. Rumors abounded that the Old Lion had been poisoned by the Red Viper of Dorne, or by agents of the North, or by a hired sellsword. Conspiracies multiplied, each pointing in a different direction. But no one had proof. Ned and Robb took advantage of the confusion, securing the Riverlands. Riverrun was safe, and the phrase fell back into line, offering only token grumbling. Soon, the Northmen found themselves in a far stronger position than they had dreamed. The impetus for a prolonged war ebbed. Men whispered that perhaps they could achieve a truce or independence without more major battles. When a new offer of negotiation came from King's Landing, this time carried by a properly credentialed envoy, Ned was prepared to consider it seriously. Cersei demanded the return of Jaime in exchange for Sansa and a sworn promise that the North would not march on the capital. Ned hesitated. He still did not know if Arya was truly beyond their grasp. But if Arya was free, then perhaps they no longer needed Jaime as leverage. On the other hand, letting Jaime go might reignite the Lannister threat. Robb argued for caution. The Northern Lords were split, but the tide was turning in favor of an armistice. Men were weary of bloodshed, and with Tywin gone, the Lannisters lacked the leadership to coordinate a renewed offensive. A council of Northern Lords decided that, if King's Landing granted them favorable terms, restoring Ned's titles, guaranteeing the North's autonomy, disclaiming any vengeance for the fiasco in King's Landing, then releasing Jaime might be acceptable. All the while, Ned bore the knowledge of what he had done. Sometimes, late at night, he would look at the coin the Faceless men had given him, turning it over in his hand. The skull leered at him, a mocking reminder that he had purchased a man's death. A man who had orchestrated monstrous deeds, perhaps, but a man nonetheless. One morning, he walked to a quiet stretch of riverbank and hurled the coin into the water, watching it vanish beneath the surface. It felt like the closest thing to absolution he could manage. Despite everything, Ned remained plagued by nightmares. He saw the assassin's masked face, saw Tywin's final gasp for air, foam flecking his lips. He saw the war's dead, the men on the fields, the villages burned, the children orphaned. But in the waking world, he moved forward, determined to salvage what he could of House Stark's future. Sansa was safe by his side. Arya, he prayed, was on her way to Winterfell or the Wall. Robb was forging a reputation as a wise young leader. With luck, the direwolf banners would fly unchallenged in the north, free of Lannister shadow. At last, a raven arrived from King's Landing, bearing a formal offer of peace. The letter was sealed by both Joffrey Baratheon's golden wax and Tyrion Lannister's personal signet as hand. The terms recognized Ned's lordship over the North and offered a ceasefire. In exchange, the North would release Jaime Lannister, and Ned would swear not to raise arms against the crown unless attacked. Cersei demanded Sansa's presence at court again as a ward, but Ned refused that part outright. Negotiations through letters and ravens followed. In the end, Tyrion seemed willing to compromise, perhaps to prevent the realm from fracturing further. A final agreement took shape. Jaime would be ransomed back for gold and for the promise of no retribution against House Stark. Sansa could remain with her family, though officially still betrothed to Joffrey, though that betrothal might never actually take place if the realm remained uneasy. It was a precarious peace, built on shaky alliances and mutual exhaustion. Yet it was better than endless war. By the time Ned rode south to meet the Lannister envoy near the Twins, where Jaime was held in captivity, summer was well advanced. Warm breezes stirred the grass, and the scars of war were beginning to fade from the land, if only on the surface. On the appointed day, Tyrion Lannister himself arrived with a small retinue, not trusting his sister's men to handle matters. Jaime was turned over, bruised in pride but physically intact, and payment was counted out in front of all. Tyrion gave Ned a crooked smile. "Well, Lord Stark," Tyrion said, "it seems you and I have come to an accord. My father might spin in his grave at the idea, but perhaps it's for the best." Ned met his gaze, remembering all the twists and turns that had led here. "We'll see if it holds. Neither of us wants more bloodshed, I think." Tyrion nodded gravely, surprising Ned with his sincerity. "You have my word, for whatever that's worth in these times." He gestured to Jaime. "My brother is free. I assume that ends our formal business." Ned glanced at the Lannister knights behind Tyrion, who looked uneasy, as if half expecting betrayal. "Aye, our war ends here, for now." He and Tyrion exchanged bows, though the tension between them was palpable. Jaime said nothing, merely stared at Ned with an unreadable expression, then turned to mount his horse with Tyrion's retinue. They rode off, leaving the northern men to disassemble their war camp. Robb was not present. Ned had insisted he remain in Riverrun, leading the bulk of their forces in case of treachery. But everything passed without violence. In the weeks that followed, the Northmen gradually withdrew from the Riverlands, returning home to rebuild and prepare for the winter that would inevitably come. Catelyn and Sansa rode at Ned's side. Rumors drifted in. King's Landing was still tense, but Tyrion was working to keep Joffrey from lashing out. The Tyrells consolidated power in the Reach. Stannis lurked at Dragonstone, eyes on the throne. The Game of Thrones continued, but House Stark had, at least for the moment, stepped off the board. One evening, as they made their slow journey north, Ned found himself riding alone, letting the column of men pass ahead while he lingered near a quiet glade. Sansa and Catelyn had gone on to the next campsite. He dismounted near a patch of wildflowers, resting on a fallen log. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, warm against his weary face. GHT of how close he had come to losing everything. He thought of the shocking, deadly contract he had forged in the darkness of King's Landing, and all the anguish it had caused. Yet, ironically, it was that vile deed, hiring assassins to kill Tywin, that had broken the Lannister war machine and allowed the Starks to negotiate from a position of strength. His honor was forever tarnished, but his family lived. Ned gazed at the green canopy overhead. He offered a quiet prayer to the old gods, asking for forgiveness, or if not forgiveness, then at least understanding. He had done what he thought necessary to protect his children, to preserve the North from destruction. If there was a price to pay after this life, he would pay it. A slight breeze rustled the branches. For a moment he almost imagined hearing a voice. Was it the old gods, whispering that winter was still coming, that the realm's trials were far from over? He took a long breath. Yes, winter would come, and new storms would gather. But for now, House Stark had survived. That would have to be enough. He mounted his horse again, guiding it back toward the marching column. In the distance, he saw the banners of the direwolf flapping in the gentle wind, the bright sun catching the gray on white. Somewhere ahead, Sansa might be humming a northern tune, dreaming of safer days. Robb would be consulting with his captains, resolute as ever. And Arya, he prayed she was alive, forging her own path north. He had not seen her since that terrible day in King's Landing, but he believed she would find her way home eventually. And if the gods willed it, they would all stand together in Winterfell's great hall once more. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant blossoms, a fleeting hint of peace. Eddard Stark pressed his heels to the horse's flanks and rode on, leaving behind the shadows of guilt and vengeance. There was no undoing what had been done, but there was a future yet for the Starks, and for the North, and for all those who had survived the terrible storm. No matter how dark the world might become, a new day would always dawn, and in that dawn, he would do his utmost to uphold whatever honor remained, for his family, for the North, and for the sake of a realm that might yet learn to live without the endless cycle of blood for blood.